request sir to kindly address the students. And before that, I would request everyone to kindly switch off their cameras and microphones so that we can have a proper bandwidth. So over and out to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Divyanshu. And namaste to everybody. I'm pleased to see that there are so many people attending this webinar. I think that it will be helpful for the bandwidth that we have at our disposal if people mute themselves, so mute their audio and turn off their video. Although you will not be visible to me, you can become visible to me again during the question and answer period. Today, I would like to talk about Himalayan populations. And as the subtitle says, we will be talking about topography, language families, and then ethno-linguistic relationships in that order. The photograph that you are viewing is taken from a Bhutanese jet flying from the Bhutanese airport to the Nepali capital in Kathmandu. And of course, this is Mount Everest and some of the other highest mountains in the world, which is only one small part of the Himalayas. The Himalayas, as it is usually pronounced in English, and the other pronunciation in English is Himalayas, which makes more sense because we say Himalaya. But in English, many people say Himalayas, and other people in England say Himalayas, but it depends on which social class you belong to, which pronunciation you use. But it is a plural in English, and it stretches for over 3,600 kilometers, beginning in the east in the Hazarajat highlands of Afghanistan, and it stretches all the way to the west to the Liangshan Hills in Sichuan province of China. So it is a very long chain. And if you, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but when we were trying it out earlier, my pointer was visible. So here it is now in the Thar Desert. It is now in the Thar Desert. And if you see this is the Kaligandaki. It starts here in Tibet and it flows right through the Himalayas or Himalayas and flows onto the Gangetic plain and is a tributary this way to the Ganges. This is a very deep river valley. In fact, it is the deepest river valley on the surface of our planet, and we will be referring to it in a few of the coming slides. Here you see the Tibetan Plateau, and this is the Tarim Basin, and of course here is the Gangetic Plain, and the Ganges flowing in this direction, and the Brahmaputra flowing in this direction. So this is a very long Himalayan chain. Here we see it again from another perspective, and you see the Tibetan Plateau in the background, and you see the Ganges or the Ganga flowing from west to east in the foreground. And then you see the Himalayan chain separating the two. The western extremities of the Himalayas are punctuated by the Tirich Mir in the Hindu Kush, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and also by the Pamir Mountains, which are between Tibet and Tajikistan, also a small portion of Afghanistan and Pakistan and the very northern part of the Republic of India. The eastern end of the Himalayas or Himalayas is punctuated by the Kapo in eastern Tibet. As you know, after the Chinese occupied Tibet, and they are still occupying Tibet, they have administered and imposed new provincial boundaries. So Gang Khapo is traditionally and geographically still in eastern Tibet, but it may now be classified as part of Yunnan province, I think, but it is not historically part. And of course, Kakaburazi in northern Burma is also a peak in the Himalayan region. Let me see if we can move to the next slide. There we are. Now, 5 of the world's tallest mountains, the tallest mountains in the world, are called Achttausender in German. And even if you speak English, or if you speak Hindi or French, people who are mountain climbers refer to these highest mountains as Achttausender, which means peaks above 8,000 meters, because it is a German expression used in mountaineering and used in alpine sports. And 5 of these lie within the internationally recognized political borders of India. Now they are located behind the line of control, but actually they form part of the Republic of India. K2 is the 2nd highest mountain in the world, and this is of course looking west across the Himalayas. Here with my pointer, I am showing you the Tarim Basin. Here's the Tibetan Plateau. Here again, you see the Kaligandaki going right through the Himalayas, and here you see Nepal and Bhutan. But in the far west, which is what we are focusing on now, we have these high mountains, and here you have the Pamir range, and here you have the Hindu Kush, which are outlopers or spurs of the Western Himalayas. And here we have the five of the 14 highest peaks in the world, the K2, the Nanga Parvat, and the K5. These were the numbers that were given to these peaks during the survey called the Trigonometric Survey of India. So the Trigonometric Survey of India assigned these names to these peaks. K5 has another English name, Hidden Peak, and it has another name, Gashar Brum. Because you see this written in Nastaliq script used for Urdu, you might think that this is an Urdu name. It's not an Urdu name. It is a Balti name because, of course, Baltistan, where 3 very archaic Tibetic languages are spoken. It's a very archaic form of Tibetan or a very archaic Tibetic language, and Gashar Brum means beautiful mountain. So that is one of these high peaks. Broad Peak, which is usually only known to mountain climbers, and K4, which is Gashar Brum 2, here in the west of the Himalayan range. Now, 8, or one could say most, of the world's 14 Achttausender lie in the Kingdom of Nepal, or now the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal, or on the borders of Nepal. Everyone knows Mount Everest. Actually, for many centuries, the mountain has and still is called Jomolangma in Tibetan, and it was known to be the highest mountain in the world to the Tibetans. And when Jesuit priests were visiting Tibet and traveling through Tibet, they wrote down that this mountain, Jomolangma, was the Mons Omnium Altissimus in Latin, and they published this already in 1646 in Europe. So it was already in a published printed book in the West that this was the highest mountain in the world. And then when 2 surveyors, one Indian surveyor and one British surveyor in the Trigonometric Survey of India measured the mountain, they were not allowed to enter the Hindu Kingdom of Nepal, and they had to measure from the East India Company territory, which is now the Republic of India, and they measured from a distance, and then they named it after their boss, George Everest. So it is Mount Everest. And Sagarmatha is a new name given to the mountain in Nepali. New because it is not as old even as I am. whereas Jomolangma is centuries old. This is the tallest mountain in the world. If you look here, this is of course a spacecraft, and I am above the spacecraft taking this photograph with my iPhone. And if you look here, this is the Tibetan Plateau. And here you see the Kaligandaki flowing right through the Himalayas. Again, we use as a point of reference, and then it flows off into the Ganges, which is flowing here from west to east. And this, please try to remember this. This is a lake, and this is an extremely large lake, and there are many extremely large lakes in Tibet. And this one is called Paku, Lake Paku. And we will use it also as a point of reference. So this is Nepal, the Kaligandaki here flowing through Nepal, and all the way till here, till we get to Sikkim. So these mountains are known to most of you. They have Tibetan names or Nepali names. Just one of the 14 world's 14 8,000er lies in Tibet. And here we are now looking west again. So this is a spacecraft again, a space shuttle. And here you see all of these lakes. And these lakes are incredibly large. And if you remember, this is Lake Paku, but now viewed from the other side, viewed from the east, looking west across the Himalayas, and this, or northwest across the Himalayas. This is the Kaligandaki. This is very interesting, and you should have thought about it, and you either already knew it or it should have occurred to you otherwise, that this river starts on the Tibetan plateau, flows right through the Himalayas, and then flows into the Ganga. The Himalayas are the highest mountain range on the planet, yet there are rivers flowing right through them. How is that possible? These rivers happen to be older than, happen to be much older than the Himalayas themselves. Only one of the peaks, Shishapangma, which is called Gosai Ta in Nepali, is located entirely within Tibet. And if you look at Baku and you move in this direction towards the Everest Massif, and a number of these 8,000 are in the Everest Massif. But this one here is Shishapangma. Here we have a view from above the Bay of Bengal, looking towards the Himalayas. And here we have Sri Lanka, and here, of course, you have Burma. Here we have the Andamans, here the Nicobaris, and here we have India. And here we have this incredibly long mountain range. So first I want to impress upon you the length of the topography, and we said it is 3,600 kilometers long from these spurs in the east to the spurs in the west, and it is the largest land barrier on the planet. Here again, this is Lake Baku. We do not see the Kaligandaki because that is in this direction, but we are looking here towards the east. Very high mountains here include some of these 8,000er and including Mount Everest here. Shishapangma is here, and these mountains are the highest mountains of the world. Makalu, also here, one of the highest mountains in the world. This is Kanchenjunga on the eastern border of Nepal. So this is the Tibetan Plateau, and here is Nepal. And this is the border between Nepal and Sikkim. And all of this is part of Sikkim, these mountains going around. And here we have the Chumbi Valley in between the northern part of Sikkim and the northern part of Bhutan. And here we have Jomolhari in Bhutan. So we're looking in a south-eastern direction across east-southeast across the eastern Himalayas. So these are incredibly large mountains. There are no mountains larger. Yet in the eastern Himalayas, where we find most of these mountains, we're going to show you something remarkable about this roughest topography on the planet, this highest mountain range. This is in the middle of the Himalayas. I told you that the middle of the Himalayas is formed by the Kaligandaki River. And now I'm telling you that the middle of the Himalayas is marked by the Dhaulagiri in Nepal, which is very close to where we usually are working in the garden and doing things like that in Nepal. So this is one of the 8,000, and it really lies in the middle of the Himalayas because 1,800 kilometers of the range lie to the west and 1,800 kilometers of the range lie to the east. And this mountain is in the middle, right next to the Kaligandaki. And that's what makes this the deepest river valley on our planet, because it is 8 kilometers deep. Here, the Kaligandaki, this is taken from, or it is a graphic projection generated, but true to life and to scale, from above Mustang, which is used to be a kingdom of Tibet, underneath the principality of Gugge, but it was conquered by the kingdom of Jumla in the 12th century already. And so later, when Jumla became part of Nepal, Mustang is also part of Nepal. So Jumla is an Indo-Aryan kingdom, and it conquered this part of Mustang. But we're looking down beyond Mustang. We are looking down through many Nepalese districts, and you can see that the Annapurna is on one side, and actually you can take a beautiful trek through Nepal, and then you are north of the highest peaks of the Himalayas, and then you descend into Mustang here via Muktinath. So we're looking down, and these mountains, these green mountains in the back, we are looking south. These green mountains are also part of Nepal. They are the Mahabharat Lake. And these mountains are also part of Nepal. They are the Shivalik Hills. And then this, clothed in a purple haze, that is India. I have written it here in Nepali with the Nepali names, but presumably you can read that just as well. So Annapurna, Kaligandaki, and Dhaulagiri. This is just to give you an idea of the topography. Topography is relevant to biology, as we shall point out in the next part of this lecture. And also you can think high mountain ranges are also relevant to biology, human biology, but we know from archaeological finds that this is an ancient trade route. And we do not mean a Bronze Age trade route, but a Neolithic trade route. Already in Neolithic times, this thoroughfare from the Tibetan plateau to the Gangetic plain, the Ganga, is an old trade route that existed for millennia. So here I'm showing you the Eastern Himalayas, and it says here the Himalayas represent the tallest land barrier on our planet, yet one of the world's major language families straddles the Himalayan range, meaning it is on both sides, especially the Eastern Himalayas, which we are looking at here. Here the Chutangpo, as the Tibetans call it, flows through Tibet, then it goes through Arunachal Pradesh, which is of course in India, and it is called the Siang, and then it empties and becomes the Brahmaputra, and the Brahmaputra and the Tsangpo are the same river, and they enter here, and here it enters, the Ganges comes from the west, and here we see the mouth of Ganges and Brahmaputra, the Sundarbans in this area in eastern Bengal, western Bengal, eastern Bengal, or Bangladesh. Here Bhutan, here Sikkim, and here Nepal. So this is the eastern, and here we see Arunachal stretching around, and of course Mizoram, Manipur. And this is the Meghalaya with the Garo Hills and the Khasi Hills constituting the Meghalaya Massif. So this is an incredibly rough topography, yet, as I'm telling you, there is a language family that straddles this topography as if though it is totally porous, a porous membrane that you can go through. So this language family is called Trans-Himalayan because the language communities are distributed all across the Himalayas. And the old name that is also valid for this large language family is Tibeto-Burman. You will hear old names used by less capable scholars, Let us call them that. There are 2 or 3 of them for which I would use even more sharp words, but they are less capable of scholars, and there are a few of them who use this term Sino-Tibetan or Indo-Chinese, but they actually denote false phylogenetic models from a linguistic point of view, because a phylogeny is based on evidence, just as a phylogeny is based on hard evidence in molecular biology. In historical linguistics, a phylogeny is based on hard historical linguistic evidence. Here we see the world's 2 most populous language families. Tibeto-Burman is shown in blue, also known as, we have already showed, as Trans-Himalayan, and the world's most populous language family is Indo-European, which of course has an Indo-Iranian branch, which again, Indo-Iranian has another branch, which is Indo-Aryan, which is most of these languages in northern India. And if you look, there's this border between blue and red, and it goes right through the Himalayas. So the highest peaks are north of this border. They are here, yet this language family straddles these highest peaks to the other side. And you will see many white areas. Of course, these white areas are also inhabited, but people there are speaking languages which are neither Indo-European nor Tibeto-Burman, because they belong to other language families. These other language families, I can also tell you a lot about them, but not today because our lecture time is limited. But of course, here you know this is a Dravidian language here in Pakistan, and there are Dravidian languages here, and these are Altaic languages here, and in much of this area. So, and here we have other languages. We will actually look at some of these languages, but we will not be looking at Dravidian or Altaic today, for example. But we will be looking at some of these other language families, because this is already quite amazing that if we look at this, the linguistic barrier does not match the topographical barrier. It does not match the topography. So it is as if though the rugged topography, the highest land barrier on the planet, is totally permeable for language and language families. Here is the same, and now we are looking at the same map, but now the blue and the red are not languages, they are Y chromosomal polymorphisms. And if we look at the map, we see that the Y chromosomal polymorphisms are also completely impervious to the existence of this tall land barrier, but they do correlate with this linguistic barrier. So this is an amazing find. And of course, we have known this for some time, for a number of decades, in fact, but 2 decades at least. But it is an amazing find because it shows that the genes and the languages are correlating in a statistically relevant way, but the topography or the geography is not correlating with either the genes or the language in a straightforward way. And this is an interesting finding. So this is what I wanted to tell you about topography. Now we are going to move on to the other topics. This is a map, and it is a linguistic map. And the map was made by geneticists, not by linguists. They were made by geneticists with whom I was collaborating in the Kingdom of Nepal, as it was at the time, now the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal. And we were working on sampling, taking genetic samples, DNA samples from all of the language communities in Nepal. And as you can see, this is quite diverse. And here they are numbered for you so that you have the names. And these colors are also meaningful because these are Limbu languages or Yakaba languages, Yaktung languages. And here we have Yakaba languages, which are Eastern Kiranti languages. Here you have Central Kiranti languages, here you have Western Kiranti languages, and we have all of these other groups, and the individual names of the groups are listed here. And these are just some of the Tibeto-Burman groups. They are not all. This is not an exhaustive map. This is just showing you part of the topography. And you can measure genetic distance. You all probably have learned in your courses in Benares, at Benares Hindu University, how to measure genetic distance. We can also quantify linguistic distances in terms of the differences between phoneme inventories, phonological repertoires, the morphological systems, sound change, systematic phonological change called Lautgesetze, which is the German term, but used internationally in linguistics. In English, it would be sound laws, so regular sound change. We know this. So if you're looking at this here, you're looking at just two of these numbers I'm taking at random, 29 and 32, and I happen to know this area very well, and language 32 I can speak myself. So this difference here between 32 and 29 is just as large as the difference between German and English. German and English are related languages. Indo-European scholars might call them related dialects, English and German. But if you understand English, you do not automatically understand German. The difference is quite significant. This is the degree of difference that we have, linguistic degree of difference that we have throughout this area. And the differences between, for example, Dura, the Dura language, and 32 here is far larger. It is part of the same language family, but also Hindi and English are part of the same language family. Russian and English are part of the same Indo-European language family, but the differences are large. These differences here are as large in terms of time depth and quantifiable difference between a language like Dura and a language like number 29, which I can tell you is Yakha. And I told you this group is the Yakaba languages, all different Yakaba group languages, and this language, which is Pedape, which is a form of Limbu, an archaic form of Limbu, of which I wrote the grammar and of which I can speak. So you cannot underestimate this linguistic diversity. However, what I'm showing you here is only central and eastern Nepal and only the higher mountains and the mid-hills, but not the highest mountains, because we're not talking about the Tibetan dialect spoken north of this area, but still within Nepal, for example. And we have not talked about the languages, all of the languages on the plains. So this is just a small part. And of the linguistic diversity within Nepal, which is 3 times Switzerland. But India,
बहुत एक्टिव है ये.
Hello.
Yes, sir, there was
So, okay, yes, please, people should unmute themselves because it helps to for the bandwidth and for the reception until the question and answer period. So this is just Nepal, and this book should be in the university library at Benares Hindu University. And if it is not, you should ask the librarian to get it, and not because I wrote it, but because these 1,475 pages contain many detailed maps of parts of India and the Indian Himalayan region, and as well as of Bhutan and Nepal, but particularly of the Indian Himalayan region, so the entire Himalayas, linguistic maps which are relevant to you as students of biology who are looking at human population genetics. So for this reason, you should use this source. Now, we are moving into linguistics. We are leaving topography and moving really into linguistics. These are all names, some of which, if you are from the Northeast, and I know that there are students from the Northeast because I have been to Benares Hindu University and met students there who are from the Northeast. And some of you may not be from one of these groups, but you may be from the Northeast anyway. So you will recognize some of these names. However, each of these names is not a language. each of these names is a linguistic subgroup. So just as Indo-Aryan is a linguistic subgroup in the Indo-European language family, of which Hindi, Gujarati, Bengali, Nepali are all members, each of these names, many of which might be unfamiliar to you, is a subgroup. Sometimes they contain a single language, such as Lepcha, which is a language spoken in Sikkim and Darjeeling district, Kalimpong, also in a neighboring part of Nepal, and a few villages in Bhutan as well. So you have, but it's one language, but it is one group. You have this in Indo-European as well. Within the Indo-European language family, you have a branch called Albanian. There's one language there, Albanian, but it is also a separate branch of the family. So we have branches which have only one member, such as Lepcha, or if I can find it quickly, here, Gongduk. But there are many branches. Here is Sinitic, but it has roughly a dozen languages. Some of them you will have heard of: Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese, Hakka, Shanghainese or Wu. So these are languages with many speakers, and there are a dozen languages here. Here we have Kiranti, which is a group that we also already discussed, and this has roughly 30 different languages, entirely distinct languages, meaning mutually unintelligible languages, not just dialects. So these show the subgroups. And as geneticists, of course, and as biologists and as scientists, and even as linguists, you look at all of these major subgroups and you would like to see a tree connecting them. You would like to know the phylogeny. Well, actually, some language families are better studied than other language families. And this language family, although I am one of the many people studying this language family, has not been studied that well that we actually know the structure of the tree. There are people who have been putting forward false family trees. We mentioned Sino-Tibetan or Indo-Chinese. Those are false language family tree models, because people who speak Chinese like to think that they are the center of the language family. And actually, these subgroups really show the diversity of the language family, because each of these groups, some containing up to 40 different and distinct languages, this shows that the center of diversity is here. It is not between Chinese and the rest, nor is it between Gongduk and the rest. It is in the middle of all of these complex groups. So where are these groups located, geographically distributed? Here is a map which shows the distribution of the groups. This is not a distribution of the languages, because one of these dots, I told you, could represent a language in exceptional cases, but except for those exceptional cases, in most cases, they represent a dozen to as much as 3 dozen or more different languages represented by one dot. And as you can see, the diversity of this language family and most of the major subgroups of this language family lie within India. They lie squarely south of the Eastern Himalayas and within the Indian subcontinent. And in fact, Bhutan, Nepal, and India have most of these groups. There are groups in Burma, of course. Burmese itself is a trans-Himalayan language or a Tibeto-Burman language. And Mandarin Chinese and the other Sinitic dialects, which is what the Chinese like to call them, although they are entirely distinct languages. In southern China, Cantonese, and here you have Wu dialects. All of these are subsumed under this dot. And you can tell as a linguist, just as a linguist, from looking at the center of linguistic diversity and by doing your comparative studies and your historical grammar and your historical phonology, that not only does the center of diversity lie here, but the linguistic homeland, you're going to look for it in this area. And the ancestors of the Chinese do not come from here. And the ancestors of the people in the Northeast do not come from here. And of course, there are different types of ancestors, and that's what we will talk about next. The linguistic ancestors. The linguistic ancestors of the people in the Northeast do not come from China. Rather, the linguistic ancestors of the first speakers of Old Chinese come from this area, where you still have the highest linguistic diversity. Now, this is a map for which I must apologize because I'm not responsible for it. I did not make it. In fact, in italics at the bottom, I say one thing about the map that irritates me. This irritates me. This is false. And if anyone amongst the students is a gifted graphic artist, I will send this map as a high resolution file and you can correct it for me, because I want to show a proper version of this map. This map is irritating, but it's not about this. It's about this yellow. This yellow stretch shows the geographical distribution of the Trans-Himalayan language family. And we saw that most of the groups and most of the diversity are located in this area. This is where we see the diversity and the high phylogenetic depth of the language family. Yet, we see all of this area, even Taiwan now, actually all of Taiwan is Chinese speaking, but we show part of the language not Chinese speaking, and you will understand why before the end of this talk, because this is historical. So this is the extent, the geographical extent, and that is because certain languages, take a language like Mandarin Chinese, with so many million speakers, or a language like Bengali, or Hindi, or English. How many million people speak English, and yet it is only the language of one island off of the European coast originally. So languages can spread secondarily, and that's what has happened here. But the linguistic diversity and most of the languages themselves, as well as most of the language groups, are spoken within India. This is something that you can see as a linguist. Now, this map has to be corrected, and if one of you is graphically gifted, because I am not, I would appreciate a corrected version of this map. And what has to be, I never met this woman, but I know she lives in Marburg in Germany. So I don't even have contact with her, but she did this map for me. But that one thing irritates me. Now, there are 3 different ways of looking at the past, and they give you 3 different types of data sets, and these data sets are separate one from the other. Population genetics tells us about molecular polymorphisms. It tells us about how we are related to different groups of people, but also how we are related to different primates, and how we are related to primates in Madagascar, how we are related to the orang-utan, how we are related to all other mammals, rodents, and the mice that scamper across the floor. It also tells us how we are related to other eukaryotic life forms. So with population genetics, you can go back in time for a very long period of time. With paleontology and archaeology, we can only go back in time to the time of the Oldovon culture, and then we have the Aeschylean culture, and then we have the Upper Paleolithic horizon with all of this art, and then we have the ancient civilizations, and to the present. This is material culture, and this is linguistics. And because I am a linguist, Manish Gautam has made a squiggle on the slide. If you look at the linguistics, then linguistics has the shallowest time depth. And as a linguist, I have distorted this slide to show you that linguistics is much larger than it actually is. But in fact, and you are all familiar with exponential growth and logarithmic scales, this is only the surface of the past that we can scratch with linguistics, because language changes too fast. So there are 3 different time depths accessible to these different disciplines, and linguistics is only able to work in this very superficial time depth. So we can only look in the past 20,000 years, perhaps. Certainly the Holocene we can look at maybe a little bit further, but not much further than that. We cannot say anything meaningful about the Upper Paleolithic horizon, for example. Well, we can perhaps, but that's the topic of another lecture and not this lecture. And we cannot say anything meaningful about this. In addition to the difference in time depth, there are 3 different types of evidence. There are 3 different data sets. They are not identical. They're not, they can be correlated, they do not have to be. So linguists, they like to look into the past. Some of them, they are known as historical comparative linguists. And these historical linguists have been looking at this trans-Himalayan language family, even when it was still called Tibeto-Burman. And they've been trying to relate it to other Asian language families. The trouble is that there's very little empirical evidence when we use the historical linguistic empirical methodology, which is known as the comparative method, which is a strict way of assessing empirical evidence for language relationships. We cannot go back that far. So we're actually gazing beyond the linguistic event horizon. It's the furthest we can gaze. And all of these people, and I've given their names, Gustav Schlegel, Vida Osterpirat, Wilhelm Schmidt, Lawrence Reed, all of these people have published from the beginning of the 20th century to the present. They have published about suspected relationships, the Kradai language family, relating it to Austronesian, or Austroasiatic with Austronesian, or relating Austroasiatic, Austronesian, Kradai and Tibeto-Burman, or relating these with Hmong-Mien, a subset of these with Hmong-Mien, or relating them all together, Stanley Starosta, who died in 2001. But he presented this paper in 2001, and he presented some evidence, and it is similar to the evidence that was adduced previously, but it is very weak evidence, and it is very little. So as linguists, we can go as far back as to establish language families, but actually establishing relationship between language families, because that is what a language family is. It is what we as historical linguists can see and recognize as a related group of languages. And trying to speculate on relationships between language families is highly speculative, but this is what linguists have come up with so far. So this is the best that has been done. And this is the language family, and it is called the Benares recension because I told you that Stanley Starosta died in 2001 and could say nothing more about the matter. However, I attended his talk and I spoke to him and I had his handout, and later his paper was published, and the editors, there were 3 editors, and one of them I interfered with some of the data, and the diagram was not the same diagram as Starosta presented. Actually, it was slightly changed, and I have made it back to the way Starosta presented it, and I have rearranged the order, meaning from right to left, not the structure of the family tree. So this is Starosta's work, not my work. I don't want to take credit for it, but in correcting what the editors did after the man had died, and his work was published in 2005, I have, and I presented it at Benares Hindu University in 2012, or maybe 2011, but it was published in 2012, and that is why I call it the Benares recension. So this is basically Starosta's tree as he intended it in 2001, and as it was presented again accurately at Benares Hindu University. And now a generation of students later, or a few batches of students later, you are seeing it again. But I would ask you, this East Asian theory, this linguistic theory, this is established, this is linguistically accepted, consensus of opinion, this is a language family, Trans-Himalayan or Tibeto-Burman. I would ask you to remember this name because we have discussed this language family already. I would also ask you to remember this name, Yangtzean, named after the Yangtze River. Hmong-Mien is Yangtzean. Austroasiatic, we must also remember because it is an important group, and geneticists at Benares Hindu University have been doing important work on Austroasiatic language communities, so you must remember this as well. And Austro-Thai consists of Kradai and Austronesian. And I would ask you to remember these names as well, Austronesian and Kradai. So Austronesian, Kradai, Austroasiatic, Yangtzean, and Trans-Himalayan. And based on the evidence he looked at, and the evidence is shaky. So, but people have, but it is indicative. So many people have stumbled across the same idea. This is the phylogeny that he presented. Stanley Starosta presented that. So these four major East Asian language families, they might be related at a time depth that is beyond the time depth that historical linguists can access. So it is beyond what I call the linguistic event horizon, beyond the horizon of the linguistically reconstructible past. And here again, the names that I want you to remember so that you can understand the rest of this lecture. Yangtzean, Austro-Thai, Austroasiatic, and Trans-Himalayan. We've already discussed Trans-Himalayan. So now we're going to look at Austroasiatic, Austro-Thai, and Yangtzean. If you remember from this tree, Trans-Himalayan and Yangtzean were part of a branch, according to Starosta, and according to some people who preceded him. So let's look. This is the geographical distribution of Himalayan languages, which Stanley Starosta called Yangtzean. If we look at this, this has historical time depth. This map shows you all of these populations in northern Vietnam, in Laos, and in Thailand. But when our grandparents were born, these groups were not here. That's very recent, when our grandparents were born. These groups had not entered Southeast Asia because they were driven into Southeast Asia after the communist rebellion against the Republic of China. So when the communists, after the capitalizing upon the chaos after the Second World War and during the Second World War, attacked the government of the Republic of China, which is why it moved to Formosa or Taiwan, and overran the country. In all of the mayhem that ensued in southern China, many of these groups left, and so this is very recent. So this distribution, since we are interested in prehistory and we are interested in physical anthropology and population genetics, this distribution here in southern China is more indicative of where the Yangtzean or Hmong-Mien peoples or language communities, where their linguistic ancestors come from. This is even more indicative because this is a map which is taken based on the Chinese chronicles. A British sinologist who is no longer here made this map, and I'm using it. And it shows that in the Chinese chronicles, as is faithfully recorded in all of the old Chinese records, this part of southern China, there were no speakers of Cantonese here in the Zhou period. People move. People have always been on the move. The Zhou dynasty period is a long time ago. It's longer ago than Julius Caesar. And if we think of Julius Caesar at the time of the Roman Empire, English is a language that you all know and that we are speaking now. And maybe none of us are native speakers of English. Maybe some of us are. But English, no language related to English, meaning no Germanic language, and no language ancestral to English was spoken anywhere in the British Isles at the time of Julius Caesar. The first speakers of English came in the 5th century AD, so in the Common Era. So only 1,500 years ago. It's very recent that the first Anglo-Saxons came to the British Isles, and before that, only Celtic languages were spoken on the British Isles, and still many Celtic languages, or a few, are spoken on the British Isles. Of course, here, people have also moved, and also everywhere, including in the Indian subcontinent. So here we have Thai tribes, or Kradai tribes, inhabiting southern China, and the Miao Yao, or Yangtzean, are living all along and south of the Yangtze, which is why Stanley Starasa named this group Yangtzean because he knew where they historically originated from, because that is not something you can guess. It's something that is recorded in recorded history, just as we know where English came from and when it came to places like England, where no Germanic language was spoken before the Anglo-Saxons came. So this is where the Miao Miao come from historically. And up here are old Sinitic, old Chinese speaking areas, the very small area actually compared to what is now China. Now we are moving on to another language family. I told you to remember Yangtzean or Hmong-Mien, and the other language family that I told you to remember is Austroasiatic. And Austroasiatic is a language family which, unlike the Trans-Himalayan or Tibeto-Burman language family, unlike that language family, we have better linguists working in this language family. This is one of these better linguists. I'm working in Trans-Himalayan, so I'm not one of these better linguists, but we have some very good historical linguists actually working in Trans-Himalayan, but this is a formidable linguist. He's a Frenchman. He lives in Cambodia most of the time. He loves India, and he comes to India, and he's studied Dravidian languages, and he loves to be in India. I guess India is probably one of his favorite countries. This is Gérard Diflot, and he is the one who, on the basis of historical sound laws, nested innovations within innovations. It works the same way as in molecular biology, that you make, for example, a Y chromosomal tree, which I can show you the newest Y chromosomal tree, but the newest, because I have it, but it's not on one of the slides of this talk. But you have branch within branch, because you have these lower groups sharing a shared innovation which they have, and then of course they share an innovation with these groups that is datable to this level, and then here you have all of these groups, Kassian, Palangic, Pakanic, Khmuic, and Perik, that share an innovation which you can date as being earlier than these innovations and later than these innovations, and that it shares. So you have sound laws, regular sound change, morphological change, that you can show the branching pattern of the tree. And this is roughly the tree that already was known from Gérard's earlier work, but the 2012 tree showed for the first time the evidence where Peyarik was, because for Peyarik, previously there had been a dotted line. No one knew exactly. And people thought it was Mon Khmer, but there's hard evidence now that we know. He has spent so much time studying these languages. The man is very old now. He's a generation older than I am, but he is he's very in good health, and he is in Cambodia, and he is a wonderful person. And like me, he loves to be in India. So, but he is in Cambodia, and unfortunately, I'm now in Switzerland. I mean, I like Switzerland, but I would rather be maybe somewhere else. So this is the geographical distribution. You've seen the language family tree, and this is the geographical distribution. You saw Munda split off. That also begs a question. It split off at a very deep level, and there can be reasons for that splitting off at a deep level. There are two different types of linguistic reasons. One can be that it is recent. Another reason can mean something else, because the Chinese like to think that the Chinese split off early, but actually there's another reason why Chinese look so different. There are other linguistic reasons why Munda looks a little bit different in some respects than the other languages. And look at the distribution. The Nicobar Islands here are the Nicobarese languages. There are a dozen Nicobarese languages. We have the indigenous languages of the Malay Peninsula, spoken by Orang Asli groups, 3 different language branches, Jahaic, Sonoic, and Semalaic, and 40 different languages spoken in this area. So you have, and here we have a branch, and there you have a branch. So we have all of these branches, and here we have Palangwa, and here we have Kassian, Palangwa here and Kassian here. So we have all of these different groups. This is the geographical distribution. Now, this is the Earth. And in the old days, behind this area, you have Europe, and you had people who were trying to escape from bland food and try to eat delicious things like people eat in India. And so they were looking for spices, and they traveled this way all down the Atlantic. Then they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and these good people were Portuguese. They were the first, not English, not Dutch, not French. They were Portuguese, and they went around the Cape of Good Hope, and then they passed this island. They named it St. Lawrence Island because São Lourenço, because they passed it on the feast day of St. Lawrence. So later they used the name Madagascar, and now this name is Madagascar, and it's on the way to Calicut or Kozhikode. Kozhikode is the first place that Vasco da Gama landed in 1498, and of course the Portuguese were first, and later the Dutch followed them. The Dutch were at war with the Portuguese, but only for 80 years. Anyway, they were at war with the Portuguese for 80 years, and they followed the Portuguese also to Kerala and also to Sri Lanka, and then they went this way. So this is interesting because this shows you half of the world, and the reason I'm showing you half of the world and pointing out Madagascar is to show you how grand this distance is, how incredibly large this distance is. This is Frederick the Haltman. So he was a spy for the Dutch Republic, and he actually lived in his younger years in Portugal. And he worked in Portugal, he spoke Portuguese, and he sailed to the Far East on a Dutch ship at the time that Holland, or the Dutch Republic, was at war with Portugal. And he spoke Malay because he was captured in Sumatra, because the Dutch were fighting the people on Sumatra, and later they converted all of the archipelago into the Dutch East Indies. And but he had a cabin boy, because on the way to Indonesia, he picked up a young man, and this young man accompanied him on his journeys. And this young man spoke Dutch because he sailed, of course, with the Dutch on the Dutch ships for a long time, but his native language is Malagasy. And then Frederick the Haltman writes about him and says, this boy, die al redelijk goed Duits sprak, also hij wel 4 jaar met onze Duitse natie gevaren hadden, which in English is, who already spoke good Dutch because he had sailed the seas with our Dutch nation for 4 years. He pointed out that the languages spoken in Indonesia were related to Malagasy, the language of Madagascar. That's not obvious when you look at the map of the world, that the language spoken here is going to be related to languages spoken here is not something obvious. It's an incredible distance. And this is the world again. And this, as you can see, is North America and Baja California. This is the Peruvian coast here, and this is the Chilean coast here of South America. This is Antarctica. This is Australia. This is New Zealand. Here's Tasmania. Here's New Caledonia. Here's Papua New Guinea. Here's Hawaii. A lot of this is French Polynesia. So there was another man who sailed also on a Dutch ship, but he was not Dutch. He was a French Huguenot, and he sailed on a Dutch ship down the Atlantic this way, and then he was a linguist. And then he sailed around Cape Horn. In fact, Cape Horn is named after the place they set sail from, which is a town in Holland. So this Cape Horn at the south of South America, and then sailed all throughout Polynesia doing research. And he was headed to the capital of the Dutch East Indies, which is Batavia. And that's where he delivered his linguistic data. the capital of the Dutch East Indies is now called Jakarta, and the Dutch East Indies is now called Indonesia. And when he landed there, he was sailing for the Dutch East India Company. Here's the logo and the flag of the Dutch East India Company. And here's the man. And he tried to return to Europe, but he died on the way back to Europe. But his linguistic data were preserved. And so he observed that the languages of Polynesia were also related to Malay. And if you look at the map of the world, it's not a map, it's a projection. These are Polynesian, this is a Polynesian language. These are Polynesian languages. Easter Island, this is a Polynesian language. This is a Polynesian language. All of these languages here are Polynesian languages in the Pacific Ocean. And this is the Indian Ocean, and Madagascar is also related to Malay. So this is a very amazing finding. All of these findings were written down by this man who did not do all of this traveling. And he wrote it down, and he wrote a treatise in a very thick treatise in 3 volumes, published in 1706, 1707, and 1708. And he published it in Latin. And if you can read Latin, I encourage you to read it, if you are interested in linguistics, because he pointed out the affinity between all of these languages. And then this man, who was German but lived in Paris, he lived in Paris, and he died in Paris also. And he wrote in French. You see him writing here in French, but he was German. He also wrote in German. But here he wrote on the indigenous languages of the island of Formosa, so the island of Taiwan. And he pointed out that he, on the basis of historical linguistic evidence, by looking at the internal reconstruction of, based on the grammatical study of these languages, and he was working with Dutch sources because the Dutch were on Formosa. He was a German in Paris. He found out that these all belong to the same language family. Later, this language family was renamed Austronesian by a Jesuit in Vienna, in Austria, but who also did not go to all of these places, but he did study the linguistic material. And now this is Bob Blust, and he does go to all of these places, and he is in Hawaii. He also used to teach and study also in Europe, in Holland, but he is an American. And he has worked for a long time in Formosa, but he is the father of Austronesian linguistics, just as Gerard de Flot is the father of Austroasiatic linguistics. And Bob Blust has published, and many Austronesian scholars have corroborated and found additional evidence supporting this language family tree for Austronesian. So this is the language family tree for Austronesian. And a language family tree tells us a lot. So you have 10 primary branches, 10 primary branches with innovations that just set these branches apart. So it's really like a spread. But this spread, Atayalek, East Formosan, Puyuma, Paiwan, Rukai, Tsoik, Bunun, Western Plains, Northwestern Phoenician, and Malayo-Polynesian, 9 of the 10 branches are represented exclusively by languages spoken only on the island of Formosa. So 9 of the 10 main branches of the language family are represented only on the island of Taiwan, not by the Chinese who came. When the Dutch colonized the island in the 1620s, and they were made to leave, they were there at the time because they initiated it. They initiated it for colonial reasons, which I can explain, but that's another lecture if you want it. Why there are Chinese on Taiwan? Because the Dutch started settling Chinese people on Taiwan. They were afraid to settle there before because they would be killed by the indigenous people. And the indigenous people were Austronesian, and they spoke different languages. And these are, again, not individual languages, but language groups. So there's more than one Atayalek language. There's more than one East Formosan languages. These are groups of indigenous languages of the island of Taiwan before the 17th century, totally undisturbed by Chinese, whom they would shoot with bow and arrow if they landed on the island, just like people who now try to land on Sentinel Island. People who landed on Formosa were shot. The Portuguese landed on Formosa, but they landed on Formosa by mistake because they had been warned, but they landed as shipwrecked and they had to escape. The Dutch, who were stubborn, I apologize, but the Dutch are stubborn. They landed on Formosa and tried to colonize the island, and they were driven off in the end. But then they had already set this settling of Chinese on the island. So anyway, Austronesian Aboriginal people are the original people of Formosa, and Malayo-Polynesian is just one branch, 1 out of 10 branches, which you can also call extra Formosan. And it's divided into Western and Central and Eastern, and which again is divided into Central and Eastern. And the Eastern is divided into South Halmahera and West New Guinea and Oceanic. And if we look at the map, we saw 2 views of the world. And before European colonial expansion, the Europeans were so proud of the fact that they managed to go in little ships around Africa and get to Kozhikode in Kerala. But these people, before European colonial expansion, they expanded all the way to the Hawaiian Islands, to Easter Island, to New Zealand, and to Madagascar. Much, much larger expansion at a much earlier time in history. And we know from the linguistic phylogeny, we know that they started here, moved across to the northern Philippines, and then spread this way, and then they split this way. And of course, now we know that the language of Madagascar is most closely related to a small subgroup of languages on Borneo here, and that they spread from Borneo here. And this split Central and Eastern, and then we have this group splitting off, which is South Halmahera and West Papua New Guinea. And then Oceanic, this is the most recent split, which is the way all the way here past Fiji to French Polynesia, to Easter Island, and then south to New Caledonia and to New Zealand and up to Hawaii. And it all started on this island. The linguistic spread started on this island. And a lot of people work on this language family. I sometimes think they are hedonists or Sybarites, because they work on languages that are easy to work on because there's no interference in these languages. They settle, there's no interference from other languages. They settle previously uncolonized lands, and therefore the sound laws are not as polluted as much by borrowing. It's easier to do the historical linguistic of Oceanic. And also you get to go visit these beautiful islands. So I think that people working on Oceanic, many of them must be hedonists. Anyway, this man, you've seen him before. He was the German who lived in France, in Paris, because he thought that was really beautiful to live there rather than in Berlin. He lived first in Berlin. Julius von Klaproth recognized that Thai was not related to Sinitic, not related to Chinese, once you moved out the loanwords. And Gustav Schlegel at the University of Leiden in Holland was the first to argue that Kradai might be related to Austronesian. So Thai, or Kradai, the Thai language spoken in Bangkok, but also the language spoken by some of the tribal groups in northeastern India, Thai languages or Kradai languages, distantly related to Austronesian, first proposed by this man. Benedict also adduced some evidence, but it was not as good evidence. The first man to adduce really good evidence is this man. This is his name, Vira. Vira is, of course, the Sanskrit name, Vira. Vira Ostapirat. Pirat is if you can read Thai, this is a Ratana. Ratana, also Sanskrit. Vira Ostapirat, or Vira Ostapiratana here. This is Vira, and this is his Chinese name. He is a Chinese Thai. He lives in Bangkok. And he adduced the first evidence that really showed and clinched the argument that the Austronesian languages and the Kradai languages are related. So I told you to remember Kradai, and this is the Kradai language family. Obsolete names are Daik or Thai Kadai, but Kradai is also the name used in Thailand. However, although this name is used in Thailand, if we look at southwestern Thai, this is the group that is a sort of rusty orange. This is the most recent expansion. These people used to live in this area. And of course, we saw on the old map, the old Chinese map compiled on the basis of the Chinese chronicles, that the Kradai lived in this area in southern China. And then they expanded into these groups and also to Hainan Island here. And then, but this expansion is historically recent. We know that because all of this area here, Thailand is now predominantly Buddhist. But if we look at central Thailand, we all know that until the 13th century, the language spoken in central Thailand was not Thai, but Mon. And that the Mon kingdom, the Dvaravati kingdom, was a Hindu kingdom. And so all of the old civilization in Thailand is Hindu civilization. And even the Thai, when they came, adopted old Hindu musical instruments and Hindu temple dancing. So this is even when the Thai entered Thailand and took over from the Hindu Dvaravati kingdom, introducing Buddhism actually, or adopting Buddhism, but this is originally a Hindu Sabhyata, but an Austroasiatic language, however. But Thai is a Kradai language, so that's another language family. So now we have looked at all of our language families. And this is, of course, Ostapirat. This is where the homeland of Austronesian, the linguistic homeland. We know that this is where Austronesian came. This is Hainan Island. This is the north of the Philippines. And this is Formosa. So this is Formosa. And this is southern China, where the Thai or Kradai tribes were originally. For your orientation, this is Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta. And here is Canton up here. So this is Canton. This is Hong Kong and Macau, and this is the Pearl River Delta for your orientation. This is Formosa, and this is, of course, the northern Philippines, and this is Hainan Island over here. And a war might start over here, because now there are, anyway, that's another topic, but a war is being, there is a confrontation here on the Pratas Islands. You can read about it in news bulletins. But it's an atoll, actually. Anyway, let's move on. Now we want to move to biology. And I told you before, when we looked at the different time depths accessible to the different disciplines, there were linguists who were pointing out a long time ago to physical anthropologists, don't confuse linguistics and biological ancestry. Biological ancestors might not be. Look at all the people in the United States, where did they all come from? And they're speaking English. And they didn't come from the same part of Europe, the English-speaking part of Europe. And many of them come from India, and many of them come from China, and many of them come from somewhere else, and many of them come from Africa, yet they are now speaking English. So, and of course, this happened in the past. It happened in Europe. Everyone in England is speaking English, but many of their ancestors were speaking Celtic. And it happened in India, it happened everywhere. So you have language shift. Linguistic prehistory and biological ancestry are two different things. And linguists who have been pointing it out are Julius van Klaproth, and another linguist who has been pointing it out and who also said many other very good things, and who was a critic of British colonial policy in India. And therefore, the Max Müller Marg and many Max Müller Bhavens are named after him because he so heavily criticized, but also because he was so knowledgeable about Vedic and Sanskrit. He also stressed that linguistic prehistory and biological ancestry are separate and should be separate things because they are separate data sets. This is what he wrote. He wrote it in German. And he wrote it here. I gave you the reference so you can consult the original, or I can even send you a PDF of the original if you read German. But I've translated it here for you, and I shall read the quote. Linguistics and ethnology, meaning physical anthropology, can, at least for the time being, not be kept strictly enough apart. And many misunderstandings and numerous controversies stem from inferences made about language on the basis of blood relationship, or about biological relationship on the basis of language. Only after each of these disciplines has, independently of the other, arrived at its own classification of peoples and languages, only then only after this has been done separately based on the separate data sets, only then can their findings be correlated and compared. But even then, we shall no more be able to speak of an Aryan skull than we would be able to speak of a dolichocephalic language. Of course, we know that dolichocephalic is a shape of a skull. It's a craniometric term, and there's no such thing as a dolichocephalic language. There's also no such thing as an Aryan skull, because Aryan is originally exclusively a linguistic term, which is the designation used by speakers of ancient Iranian and ancient Indo-Aryan languages to designate speakers of their language, as opposed to people who spoke something else. So people who spoke Avestan, Old Persian, Vedic, the language of the Rig Veda, they use this term to designate themselves and people who spoke languages like themselves, as opposed to people who did not speak languages like them. So it's a linguistic term. So there cannot be anything, no such thing as an Aryan skull. He pointed this out because people were using the word Aryan incorrectly in Germany. And although he was a German and he was a professor at Oxford, he would go over from England to Germany on several occasions to lecture the people, do not swallow this Aryan nonsense that says German is an Aryan language or that the Germans are Aryans. It's wrong. You can tell people the right thing, but many times the right message falls on deaf ears. Anyway, history has told us the Germans did not listen to him. This is what you know. This is what you study. You know that we have chromosomes, and you know why they are called chromosomes. You know that chromo means color, and somes means bodies, so these are colored bodies. They do not have these colors. These colors are fantasy colors. But when they used to dye cells, then the DNA caught the dye, and so they were colored bodies. That's why they were called originally in German Chromatiden and later chromosomen, and then this German term was also adopted into English. It's also a Greek, of course. And the Y chromosome, you know, is just a rather small chromosome. This must be a man because he has a Y chromosome. I'm not going to teach you about X and Y chromosomes because you study biology at Banaras Hindu University and you know all this. So this is to show you we're now going to talk about this. This is a professor at our university, but he is not a linguist, although I know him and have had dinner and lunch with him on several occasions and sometimes attend the same conferences as he does. He's a very nice man, but he's a population geneticist and also a mathematical modeler. And he was leading a team, Laurent Escoffier, at a time that because I'm not originally from Switzerland, and I was not originally from Bern, the university where I am now. I had the chair for linguistics at Leiden University in Holland. So at this time, when this research was done, I was not even in Bern. I was not even at this university. But this university, Laurent was here, and Laurent was heading a team of Italian and Swiss geneticists, and they were looking at correlations between Y chromosomal polymorphisms and languages around the world. And what they found is that if you looked at these correlations with other markers, say on the mitochondrial DNA, you did not find correlations that you would like to find, but you did look, when you looked at the non-recombinant portion of the genome, you did find such correlations on a global scale with the Y chromosome. And this was published before these first geographies were published, these first trees were published by Underhill et al. In 2000 and 2001. So this was already done in 1997. This is only a follow-up. So this father tongue correlation was pointed out by these Swiss and Italian geneticists. This is me, literally speaking. This photograph was taken by a girl who worked for National Geographic, and she was photographing, and she gave me the photograph afterwards. This is a Machapuchre, the Fishtail Mountain. Macha means machli in Nepali. Macha means machli, and puchar means tail. and this does not look like a tail, but because we are looking from the south, but if you are standing on this side, then the top of this mountain looks exactly like a fishtail, but you have to walk a long way to see the mountain from that perspective. Anyway, I'm flying here above this part of the Himalayas in Nepal, very close to the Dhaulagiri and the Kaligandaki that we talked about in the beginning. And I'm thinking about these genetic findings, and I am thinking about what they mean. And this is what I wrote about what they meant. The father tongue correlation is ubiquitous because it occurs everywhere on the planet, but it is not universal because we find exceptions to this correlation, this tendency. Its preponderance means its dominance, it occurs predominantly, allows us to deduce that a mother teaching her children their father's tongue must have been a prevalent and recurrent pattern in linguistic prehistory. It is reasonable to infer that some mechanisms inherent to language change may actually belong or be a result of this pathway of transition. So, why would this be? This is Thomas Kivisfield, who is a colleague of Professor Ganesh Chaube and of myself, and a good friend of both of ours. And he said, because he has this very Estonian wry sense of humor, and he says that warfare is a sex-specific Y-chromosome linked psychopathology. It is a disease connected to the Y chromosome. And you may notice that most wars are waged by men, instigated and waged by men. And of course, this is what he is referring to. And this is also why on a global scale, the Y chromosome phylogeography is shallower in terms of its time depth than what you see in terms of maternal lineages, which often reflect, but not exclusively, but often reflect first settlement, but not exclusively, because there's also movement through time in the mitochondrial landscape. It is also there, but it is not of the same scale as Y chromosome. And that is simply, if you go to uninhabited islands in French Polynesia, before the French or the Polynesians are there, and you settle one of these islands, you have to have both men and women. But once the island is settled and there's a population there, men can go in and avail themselves of local populations, kill or outrank in terms of elite dominance. They can outrank the local males and they can conquer. And you have Y chromosome spreading, and therefore Y chromosomal phylogeography is more recent. You have learned about this in your courses. You've learned about bottlenecks and how bottlenecks occur and what happens in population genetics with bottlenecks. You'll probably already have read the article by Carmen et al. That talks about all of these Y chromosome globally undergoing bottlenecks in Eurasia at the end of the last ice age. But this is because Paleolithic populations, effective population sizes were very small in the Paleolithic and even in the Neolithic. And this is also how we can imagine languages branching off and new language families being formed. So especially if these language families happen to be born by male bearers of the language, imposing not only their Y chromosome on a population, but also their language. As we mentioned in a few of the previous slides already, this Y chromosomal correlation is not universal. Baltistan is an exception, Hungary is an exception. There are exceptions, but these exceptions are well understood. And we can say a lot about these exceptions, and we can also say that landscape is more recent than the other landscape, the other markers. So this brings us to the last few slides of our talk. These are the last few slides, and these will translate all of the linguistic knowledge, the ethno-linguistic knowledge that I have tried to share with you we are going to translate that and look for correlations. And these are things that are accessible to you in all of the genetic literature, and that you can interpret knowing what you now know about in all of the language families and possible connections between the language families. We see this group here, K spreading. And actually this is a K subgroup already, because where K star is located, is that mostly in India or mostly in Southeast Asia? That is something that is being, it's a matter of controversy at the moment. But this area, or maybe it was right here. Anyway, K star is somewhere here, either in Southeast Asia or in India. And one of the sub-branches is this K2A1, which used to be traditionally called as NO1. As you know, the Y chromosomium consortium gave labels, and now the ESOG, the International Society for Genetic Genealogy, is changing these labels. So also keep in mind the mutation labels, which of course you do because you are students of biology. So here we have an N clade characterized by this mutation and an O clade characterized by this mutation. And this is what we think is roughly the geographical locus of where this split may have occurred. This is the Tibetan Plateau. This is India. I'm sure you know where we are. This is Burma. This is the Irrawaddy and the Salween. This is the Brahmaputra. It's the Tsangpo. It goes across, is the Siang going through Arunachal here, and then going and becoming through Assam up Dibrugarh, and going down to Guwahati, the Brahmaputra, and then out. And here we have the Ganges, and here we have Nepal. Here we have Sikkim and Darjeeling and Kalimpong, and here we have Bhutan, and here we have Arunachal Pradesh. Okay, let's move to the next slide. This is N. What happened with N? We know that N did this. And here are some of the articles that describe this. And I remember in Estonia, when some of these Estonian, well, actually one of the group in the Estonian group said, isn't this amazing that we find this, and we find this N star mostly in northern Burma, and it moved around like that. Isn't that amazing? All the way to Lapland. And I said, well, yes, and this is a very new view. I said, actually, no, exactly this type of map, but without the polymorphism, because we had not discovered genes yet. We had not even discovered the structure of DNA yet. Before that, in the 19th century, there were physical anthropologists who had, on the basis of somatology, which is descriptions of phenotype, physical phenotype, they had already made maps of this nature based on physical phenotype and measurements of physical phenotype in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, but still 19th century, second half of the 19th century. So this type of map, this is population geneticists finding corroboration for what physical anthropologists who were studying phenotype had already been guessing might have happened at some level. So here you have it, but we're not going to talk about N. We're not going to talk about N. We're going to talk about O. And now we're going to show the last, I think, 3 slides. This is Michael Fortescue. He's, I was actually not sure where he was from, but I think he must be an Englishman, because he was always at Copenhagen at the university in Denmark. He was in Denmark, and he studied these languages, Uralic languages, Yukagir, Nifr, Chukotko, Kamchatkan languages, and Eskimo Aleut. And now he's retired and he lives in the Cotswolds in England. And that's why I think he must be English, because otherwise, anyway, he retired to the Cotswolds. But he is a linguist, and he has published on these languages. And this is a big language phylum. It's not a language family, because Uralic is a language family. Yukagir is a language family. Nifr is a language family. Chukotko Kamchatkan is a language family, and Eskimo Aleut is a language family. those are recognized language families, recognized by all linguists. Uralo-Siberian is a linguistic phylum. That is something like East Asian. There is evidence, and he has adduced all of the evidence in 2 fat books, but it is really at the limit of what we can demonstrate empirically or conjecture with some degree of probability, argue for on the basis of linguistic data. So it is really at the, and here you see N spreading, and that it correlates very much, it seems, at least geographically, with the spread of this Y chromosome, because this is the Y chromosome spread, but the language map looks roughly the same. And now for our last 2 slides. After the last glacial maximum, O split into O subgroups, O1 and O2. This is the new nomenclature, meaning the new nomenclature updated at least as of May this year. So this is O. And you see one group splitting, moving east, and one maybe staying in this area of the Eastern Himalayas. And this is the next thing that happens. And now notice, because the Y chromosome consortium names have changed and largely been replaced by these International Society for Genetic Genealogy names. So the new haplogroup labels are underneath, but the mutation labels are kept in big print here so that you will still recognize them, because M95, many of you will still be calling this O2A or something, which is still fine. Any label is fine, it's the same thing. But this is what happens, and this is the spread. And this is now the moment for you to exercise your memory and to exercise your recollection of what I taught you about these language families. M122 is found amongst all the speakers of all of these language families, actually, to some degree. And but actually, if we look at M134 here, that is what Tibeto-Burman groups have predominantly. And if we look in Nepal, and the things I have seen from Arunachal, because Arunachal has not been done as fine mesh, not as fine mesh study of Arunachal as we have done of the Kingdom of Bhutan and as of Nepal. And M134 is the predominant haplogroup. There are other ones, but this is the predominant one amongst trans-Himalayan speakers. And then this M7 is the predominant mutation you find in the paternal lineages of Hmong Mien speakers, Yangtzean language communities, speaking Hmong languages and Mien languages, Monic languages and Hmongic languages and Mienic languages. So Hmong Mien languages, including She, which is a very strange language, but also is Hmong Mien. Anyway, this group split into 2 subgroups. Well, actually, this group O1 split into two subgroups. So let's look at that first. M119 is really present strongly in the Aboriginal populations of Taiwan or the island of Formosa. And it spreads to the northern Philippines, and it spreads all the way to Madagascar, and it spreads all the way to Hawaii, to Easter Island off of the South American coast, all the way to New Caledonia and to beyond to New Zealand. So it spreads in all these directions, and it spreads from here. Of course, in Indonesia, you have a very complex patchwork, but also you have a very complex patchwork in terms of your physical anthropology and the phenotype of people. And so you also have a complex distribution, but this correlates very clearly with Austronesian language of the community. And then this splits into this O1B. And this is very interesting because we find this all over the place, but this is particularly interesting for people in Japan and Korea, but this we think is something like Proto-Austroasiatic. And this M95, it's split here, and here we have Proto-Austroasiatic. And it's somewhere here in Southeast Asia. This is a very interesting area because, you know, famous cities like Lijiang in China and Kohima are really close to each other here in this area. So this is a very complex area, and if we don't think of the political boundaries that are historically new, but of this Eastern Himalayas and then the Mekong and the Salween and all of these, and the Yangtze, all these rivers that find their source here, and all of these mountains here. It's a very interesting area. And this is based on the study of Professor Gyaneswar Chaubey at Benares Hindu University et al. I always quote this as Chaubey et al. 2010, but actually 2011. And Gyaneswar kindly keeps correcting me, but actually it was already out in 2010. I guess it was out in print in 2011. But anyway, and then you are familiar with perhaps this article, which is online. It's available freely online by both your professor, Professor Gyaneswar Chaubey, and myself. And it's about, we mentioned this group here moving out to Japan and Korea. Well, we both wrote something about that, and it's online for you. It was published earlier this year. And this recent paper by Prajwal, perhaps you say Prajwal, we say Prajwal in Nepal, Prajwal Singh, and all of his colleagues, including some of us. So about the Munda speakers and how, when they came to India, and there's this theory, linguistic theory, and there's this one. This is the most well-supported linguistic theory, and this is a new one that is not very well supported, but it has something to say for it. So, and of course, if you look at this, the arguments for this other theory are also discussed by Chaubey and me and Van Driem in this paper on Japanese. So there are some arguments, and we discussed those, why both genetic and linguistic, but they are, this is an alternative theory. So this, and also there are archaeological arguments as well, which we mentioned. So if you're not aware of the archaeological literature, also Professor Chaubey and I have pointed that out to you in 2020, so you can look at this hypothesis. But linguistically, it does not have very strong evidence. It only has some possible indication. This is much stronger. And of course, one movement does not preclude the other. But anyway, I'm very grateful that you were so kind to invite me to Benares, even virtually, but I love Benares and I love to be in Varanasi, and I would be very happy to visit again, and I hope one day that I shall. And so I must say, Aapka bahut bahut dhanyavad for having listened. And if you want to have publications freely downloadable, they are all freely downloadable at this website, which I'll also send to Divyanshu afterwards, so you can all just click on it if you wish. And all of the publications are freely downloadable. If any of you wants to ask questions, you are most welcome to ask questions. Divyanshu can open the floor.
Sir, there are two questions in the chat box, sir. Can I convey it to you?
Oh yes, I don't know if I can see the chat box, but I will try to look.
Okay. Okay, I will convey it to you.
Yes.
First question is from Mr. Yash Gupta. He asked that how do you see the tribes and scattered population of indigenous people residing in Himalayas getting affected in future by such economically motivated anthropogenic actions?
Aha. then perhaps Yash Gupta might want to explain to me which ones he means, the anthropogenic actions, which ones is he referring to? Can he explain?
Yes, Gupta, here, please elaborate your questions.
Yes.
I
Does
think
he
he's
mean
not.
climate change? Does he mean linguistic assimilation? Does he mean?
Okay, okay. I'm reading the full text. Actually, he says that we all are aware of the fact that Himalayas are the abode of mineral and energy resources. But today, the process of extraction of resources from Himalayas is not economically viable. But in future, definitely there will be technology available to extract the resources with economic profits. How do you see the tribes and scattered population of indigenous people residing in Himalayas getting affected in future by such economically motivated anthropogenic action?
Well, that is a very good question. And it is a very good question. And you see this already in Nepal, because they have hydroelectric projects in different parts of Nepal. And what happens is that the projects are set up, and then the local people, meaning the local people who reside in that area and are indigenous to the area, because they open it up as a stock market thing, or as a company with stocks. You can buy stocks in the company after it is initially set up with government support, and then you have something that is called preferential shares in some of the big oil companies like Royal Dutch Shell, which is a Dutch-British company. Preferential shares are owned by members of the Dutch and British royal families, and these give you really a lot of more dividend than anybody else. So this type of preferential shares, and the first option to buy shares, is given only to local people in Nepal who can demonstrate with their local government papers that they are from that area. So the same thing could be done as is being done for, say, in Dolakha in Nepal, for the hydroelectric project. For local people, whether they are of the local Thangmi community or whether they are local Brahmins, they both have preferential access. And in the eastern Nepal, where you have Limbus, the local Limbus have preferential access to these. The same could be done elsewhere, because these people have been living there for so long, and because we are all part of the same planet, and we should share fairly.
Sir, we have another question from Sumit Maji. He asked that it has been seen that the influence of Hindu culture and tradition has been predominantly seen in Thailand. What was the event behind it due to which Thai people follow Hindu culture?
Yes, this is a very good question. It has a very long answer, and I can give you a very short answer to the question. But it is something that also you should know and should be aware of. Around 2,000 years ago, there was a very large Hindu expansion. And this Hindu expansion went to Suvarna Dvip and Suvarna Bhumi. This Hindu expansion was a cultural expansion by Brahmins and Kshatriya that went into Southeast Asia, which was then called Suvarna Bhumi, and they spread Hinduism. And they spread Hindu culture, and many of the instruments like gamelan, many of the instruments are based on Indian precursors and the temple dance. And it went throughout mainland Southeast Asia, and then it extended into Sumatra. Sumatra is known as Suvarna Dvip. Dvip is, of course, island, and Suvarna is Sun is gold, Sona in Hindi, Sun in Nepali, Suvarna Dvip. So this area was colonized. There was no, Islam had not yet been invented 2,000 years ago, and Christianity was just being invented at this time. So it moved, Hindu culture moved all the way to Bali, and beyond. And it moved beyond Bali, but Bali is where it is stuck, and the indigenous Balinese are Hindu, and they are Old Hindu, which means that some of the things that were invented by the Brahmanist movement in mainland India after in the last 2,000 years, they are not shared by the Balinese, who have who have preserved the old Hindu traditions, many of them without any of the innovations, because in every religion, innovations take place. There are many documented innovations in Christianity. There was no Immaculate Conception before the 18th century. That doctrine was invented in the 18th century in Christianity, in Catholicism. So you have Hinduism also changing, and you have these older forms of Hinduism in this area. And you, if you are in Java, Java is now predominantly Muslim. And there's also been Christian proselytizing activity in Java. But Java, even though they are Muslim, annually they have a fest which they call Ramayana. They do not say Ramayana, they say Ramayana, because that's the way they also have many Sanskrit words. They will say Samudera. Samudera means sea. Samudra becomes Samudera. And all of these words are in Indonesian languages, in Malay. And so even though they are Muslims, they will be dancing and doing Ramayana, which they call Ramayana, and then with Arjuna and Krishna in Java, because this is an old tradition which they practiced before Islam, and they still do it. They still have Ramayana performances. So Ramayana becomes Ramayana in Indonesian. And so you have this Hindu expansion, and there are big books. Just because something is old doesn't mean you should not read it. Charles Darwin wrote a book, and it's a very old book, but it's still a very good book. There are books written by Indian scholars, one book in 2 volumes about Suvarna Bhumi and Suvarna Dvip. I think he wrote it at Cambridge or Oxford, but it's an Indian scholar written now 100 years ago about this, and he's not the only one to write about it. Many people have studied it. And if you look at the inscriptions in Cambodia, because many of them are in Khmer, but some of the inscriptions are in Sanskrit, and you can look that the Sanskrit is slightly, how would you say, polluted with Prakrit. And what kind of Prakrit it is, what kind of influences there. You can see these people came from roughly Bihar. Many of the people behind the inscriptions must have come from roughly that area. So anyway, yes. This is a very important thing to know about. There's so much to know about history and about prehistory, but I think studying history is very important. And if you need recommendations, I can recommend things. And also many of the things that you should be reading are in my 2-volume handbook, which should be in your library, I hope.
Sir, I don't think there is any question in the chat box. So now I would request Gyaneshwar sir to kindly express his views on today's webinar. Sir, are you there?
I'm on the way traveling to home.
Okay, sir. Okay, no problem.
फिर भी मैं सुन रहा हूँ, आप कंक्लूड कर दो, ठीक है?
Okay, sir. Okay.
क्योंकि बैकग्राउंड में बहुत साउंड है, तो
So I would request Sumit to kindly conclude the session and give vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Dibyanshu. Respected chief guest of today's webinar, Professor George Van Driem from University of Bern, Switzerland. Respected professors and my dear friends, I, Sumit Maji from Team ABHILASHA, heartily welcome all of you to the first day of International Lecture Series. Team ABHILASHA for the very first time has organized an international lecture series where professors from different corners of the world will join and interact with us students. So today, on the very first day, we had with us Professor George Van Driem from University of Bern, Switzerland. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor George Van Driem for attending this webinar and
Sumit, you are not audible.
know about different.
You are not.
Hello, am I audible now? Hello.
You are not audible. Sumit, please check your audio connection. Okay, no problem. I will give what of it. Team Abhilasha would like to express its heartfelt gratitude to Professor George Van Driem, sir. It was really a very informative session. I hope all the participants would have been benefited from this session. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank all the participants for joining the session. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Namaste.
And see you again, Divyansh. Namaskar. Shall I conclude the session, or
Yes, sir.
will
Yes,
you?
sir.
You are the
Yes,
host.
sir. You can end the meeting.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, sir.